Welcome to NEXTGames, a guide to ninja series, hybrid weapon skills. Now in our last episode, we covered endgame weapons and seeing how they compare in specific situations. During that analysis, we clearly saw how the Hishi provided the greatest potential for overall DPS in both trust and party buff situations on the spreadsheet, as well as through a series of parse results. But none of the data touched upon what is arguably one of Ninja's most potent weapons these days, hybrid weapon skills. Now this video will attempt to show the progression of these weapon skills damage from an unbuff situation to a max buff situation so that you can see where the true gains start to be made and when you might start working these into your playstyle. Now let's start by picking up where we left off on our last video, where we had our parse data show that the highest DPS in a haste buff situation would be using the Hishi to do a 4-step radiant skill chain with magic burst. This achieved 5,275 DPS on our usual target of Apex bats. Now while that was the winner in that particular situation, there were many factors that made an alternative way of dealing damage more effective. Now with the release of the Naomi set from Odyssey, Ninja now has a solid path to having the right gear to make use of hybrid weapon skills. In the past, these builds required party buffs and extra rare Herculean gear augments to be effective. But with the release of this new gear, Ninja has relatively an easy path to creating a gear set that is able to utilize these hybrid weapon skills. Now using these weapon skills is unfortunately not as simple as just gearing up for them, as you also must take into account the elemental strengths of the enemy you are fighting to determine their effectiveness. Now the gear set you will want to use for your hybrid weapon skills looks like this. We have a Hishi and then a Kunomitsu in our offhand as our weapons. Then we have a Seething Bomblet +1 augmented as our ammo. Artifact +3 head. We have the Naomi gear for our body, hands, legs, and feet. We're using a JSE +2 neck, but you can also use a Fuchsia neck with only a small DPS loss. For earrings, we're using a Moonshade earring and a Friamzi earring, or you can use a Lugra earring +1 augmented in that second slot. For rings, we're using a Gear Ring or Ipamoa's ring, and then an Orpheus sash for the belt. Now the last accessory piece is the cape, which should be augmented with 30 strength, 20 magic accuracy and damage, and 10 weapon skill damage. Also please note, all of my parse results that you are about to see will be of me doing this with the Naomi gear in its augmented form, or rank 0. I do have some parse results that Riane was nice enough to share from the AH forums showing what Naomi rank 25 does so that we can draw some comparisons to how much the augmented gear helps. Now let's first show how our hybrid weapon skills perform on our usual target of Apex bats, having only capped haste as in our last video. Here we will be doing a multi-step skill chain of 2 Chi 2 and then following that up with a single or dual magic burst to finish off the bats. Here we find ourselves doing 4,700 damage, or almost 600 DPS difference than that of our best in this situation from the last video. Keep in mind, this is with the unaugmented Naomi. With rank 25 Naomi, it should almost certainly pull ahead of our previous best. Now since I don't have that rank 25 Naomi, let's continue on and add some minor buffs, and see what this does to our overall numbers. I'm going to go ahead and summon Koltada for some extra attack, and King of Hearts to relentlessly inflict the Blats with Dia so that we are weakening their defenses. When these two things are added, and just these two things, you will find that now our comparison of these numbers is much closer, with our Hishi 4-step Radiance now doing 6,400 DPS, and my 3-step Hybrid now doing 6,300 DPS right on its heels. It's also worth noting that now that we're getting into these higher DPS numbers, the accuracy of the parse is tending to fluctuate a bit more. So where the range of DPS I would see in the last video is only about 100 or so in those lower DPS levels, I'm now seeing a variation of roughly 200 DPS during my fights. I say this as it makes these two setups virtually identical in this situation, and if I were to actually have rank 25 Naomi gear, the hybrid setup would be handily winning here. Now I'll admit, the effectiveness of this hybrid setup with only Koltada buffs shocked me and made me want to keep going and see exactly what we could achieve even with my rank 0 set. So I now go ahead and add in Star Sybil for additional magic attack, and Monboro for occasional magic attack boost and occasional stat buffs. Now this change put the hybrid setup with rank 0 Naomi clearly ahead, now doing 7,000 DPS to the Radiant setup's 6,500. Now by adding the food of Popito's con queso, we complete our trust buffs, and we are now doing between 7,500 and 8,200 damage to our target of Apex bats, while the Radiant setup is only doing 6,700 damage. Now it's on this level that I started playing a bit with the hybrid setup. I found that if I stored TP until the very end of the skill chain window, I would achieve overall higher weapon skill numbers, but my overall DPS would be a bit lower, ending up at around 7,500. Meanwhile, if I weapon skilled every time that I had TP, I ended up with higher DPS numbers of 8,200 in this setup, even though my overall skill chain damage was a few thousand lower. Now this means that in a trust situation on Ninja, using hybrid weapon skills, we have a new high of 8,200 DPS with rank 0 Naomi, doing an average of 28,000 damage per weapon skill. Now to give you an idea of how much difference rank 25 Naomi would make, let's look at Reen's parse results. In his results, he was able to get around 11,000 sustained DPS with an average of 49,000 damage weapon skills. Now I do want to point out that he was not using Star Sybil, and he was fighting Apex crabs and fish in his test, so it's not a direct one-to-one comparison. However, when I tried parsing crabs and fish, I found the results very similar to that of bats, and this being said, it really should show you how much potential there is here when augmenting this gear, as it, in this situation, should boost your DPS by as much as 33%, and your weapon skill damage by as much as 50% when going from rank 0 to rank 25. Now let's move on to a party buff situation. Serveroz, my Odyssey partner, was nice enough to take some time to buff me so that I could run some parses of these weapon skills in highly buffed situations, so that we can see what potential lies there. Now in these examples, the buffs that I have include Double March, Double Minuet, Wizard's Roll, Chaos Roll, Intrust Fury, Malaise, and Frailty. Now this setup, along with the same food, put my attack at around 3,800 for these parse examples. With these buffs, I tried a variety of weapon setups and weapon skill rotations to see what led to the most DPS. Please note that the DPS numbers here should actually be quite a bit higher than the ones shown. Since we were using the Geo Bubbles, I had to commonly go grab a bat and pull him back to the bubble before attacking. This wasted 3 to 5 seconds for each mob that was normally not accounted for in my previous parse results. This was true of all of these tests done with Serveroz, so they can be directly compared to each other, but when comparing with our previous parse results, keep in mind that the buff numbers should be even higher due to this loss of time pulling on each kill. Okay, on to the results, starting with the least effective setup to the most. In our least effective buff setup, I stored TP to 2,000 plus and spammed Blade Chi with Kunomitsu in my offhand. This led to no skill chain damage and a total DPS of 8,400, only 200 more than our best trust buff situation, but we were now at least doing over double our previous weapon skill average with a new average of 66,000 damage per weapon skill. Next, we come to our two-step 2 Chi setup at 10,000 DPS, thanks to an additional 2,000 DPS from the skill chain damage. Next, I swapped in Hitaki for my Kunomitsu and was able to achieve a new high of 11,000 DPS. This ended up being the same DPS I got when I swapped in a Kraken Club for the Hitaki and saved TP until over 2,000 before weapon skilling. I'll also point out this is the same DPS that Rien got when he used just trust buffs with the R25 Naomi, again showing you just how potent that gear is when fully augmented. However, I was able to achieve a new high of 13,000 DPS with using a Kraken Club in the offhand and doing Chi 2 skill chains, normally having to follow it up with another Chi that would finish him off. 2 Chi 2 ended up being a little less DPS in the overall combination because my 2 damage was a little bit lower than my Chi damage, and he would always decide to die before the second skill chain went off anyway. either way, this ended up being my maximum right there at about 13,000 DPS. Now, I need to emphasize that when you get these high DPS numbers, the slightest changes can make huge differences, so please do not take the results I just gave as anything definitive, merely just some results based on what I saw. Several of the above party buff setups also kept leaving the mob at between 1 and 5% hit points at times, after the weapon skill or skill chain completed, which also can skew the results a bit, as it leaves just a few hit points there at the end to both lower your overall DPS and slow down the fight. Due to these small fluctuations at these high DPS numbers, you need to make sure to keep an eye on the average weapon skill damage number when looking at the results and add more weight to that than you normally would have. I still feel that the Kunimitsu is the strongest offhand option here. That being said, there is clearly some usefulness to these other two options, so I do recommend keeping either a Hitaki or a Kraken Club around so that you can play with both in the situation that you are in and determine what works best for that particular situation. Now, regardless of the choice of when to use TP or which of the three offhand weapons you use, the average weapon skill damage in all of these situations was always between 66,000 damage and 74,000 damage with my party buffs and rank 0 Nayami gear. This really should mean that any of these offhand options should be averaging over 95,000 damage in these situations once I'm at rank 25 and have these same buffs. In my mind, that last point really hammers home why I think Kunimitsu is the best option here. Because of all its additional stats, you might as well be using it over the other two options if you're always going to be hitting for over 90,000 damage anyway. Now that we've seen just how amazing these weapon skills can be, it's time for a reality check, as they aren't always this useful. Due to resistances of mobs to certain elements, it's entirely possible that a mob you're fighting would be strong to the hybrid weapon skill that you're using on it, and it's only going to hit for a few thousand damage instead of the tens of thousands you're expecting. This can happen on lots of bosses, as well as normal content, such as fodder in Odyssey. Actually, I'd like to use Odyssey as an example on how complicated hybrids can be to use. Now, I took the same setup that we used here for our max trust DPS to Sheol C to farm level 129 mobs, and on some mobs, such as Imps and Corel, I was able to tear through the mobs with 2 quick hybrid weapon skills each. However, on many other mobs, I was only doing 3 to 5,000 damage per weapon skill due to that mob's resistance. So you need to learn which are strong to your hybrids and focus on physical weapon skills for those particular mob families. Simple enough, right? Sadly not, as even though our hybrid weapon skills can do more damage than our physical on some of these mob families, it's still requiring 2 weapon skills to take out each mob, which is the exact same number it takes with my physical weapon skills when using Shun Shun. So in this example, it's really not helping me in regards to the overall time it takes to take out each mob. So where is this useful? Let's go ahead and now take a look at Sheol A, where the mobs are 10 levels lower, and I once again am taking in the exact same trust and food setup. Now once again, my weapon skills are working very well on some mobs, and not as well on others, but now at least on those mobs that it's not working well on, the weapon skills are at least doing as much as my physical weapon skills, so therefore I'm not really losing out in that situation. Additionally, we are now one-shotting about 2 in 10 mobs, making it so we don't need to use 2 weapon skills to take out each, and giving us a large time advantage over our physical weapon skill kill strategy that we would normally be doing. Now, if I were to have Nayami R25 gear, I assume that I would be able to one-shot most of these mobs that aren't resistant. This is when the hybrids are truly effective and aren't just responsible for overflow damage, but actually cutting down on the amount of time it takes to kill each mob. These are those benefits that you want to look for when trying to realize when it is you should be using those hybrid weapon skills. So really the main takeaway here is to always try your best physical damage option and your best hybrid damage option when you're first taking on a mob or new content, and see where both stack up, and make sure you're doing the most effective form of damage. Also be sure to continue checking on how it's doing as you upgrade your Nayami gear, as the effectiveness of these hybrids will shine more often as they are upgraded. Now before we wrap up this episode, I want to do a brief statement on Blade 10 and Savage Blade. Now these weapon skills are what Ninja will normally use historically to get the majority of their damage in these party buff situations. If you're finding that a hybrid weapon skill isn't doing good damage for you, and you're in one of these party buff situations, then either of these weapon skills will be your best option. Savage Blade will normally perform better here than Blade 10 would, and the more augmented your Naomi set is, the more damage that Savage Blade is going to do, and the more further ahead it's going to get of Blade 10. So keep that in mind. Now in regards to weapons for this setup, you should be using the Hishi-Hitaki combination when doing Blade 10, and when using Savage Blade, you should be using the Nagling-Hitaki combination. That's going to be it for this video on hybrid weapon skills. I hope you found that helpful. Thanks so much to ServerOz for helping me get some of these parsed results for the party buff situation, and for letting me borrow his Kraken Club. If you enjoyed this content, please be sure to click on the subscribe button under the video and the bell icon next to it to be notified when my future videos will be released. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Stay safe and stay healthy out there.